Hello, everyone. You're watching a recorded session of our LitTalk with Naomi Long, leader of the Alliance Party. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to get this to you live. A few technical problems entirely at our end, but we're delighted that Naomi is with us this evening and we'll get this onto your screens as soon as possible. And we have lots of people here in the call ready to ask questions. Over the last number of days, you've been submitting questions to me and the rest of the committee for Naomi Long. So you can listen back to this, find your question, and find out what her answer to you was. And Naomi, I want to thank you for being here. You've given up your Friday evening. I'm sure you would rather be sitting in front of the television, maybe with a glass of wine, maybe not, rather than sitting once again in front of the screen with us. So thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure to have you. Here's what I want to do. As I said, we've got lots of questions submitted to us. Before we get to that, though, I think we want to kind of take a bit of a walk through your life, a bit of a walk through your career, so people can find out a bit more about you, where you come from and what you stand for. And then we'll get into the questions that have been submitted to us and some of the people here in the call who want to ask them as well. Naomi, why don't we start at the very beginning? Born in East Belfast, 1971, Bloomfields was where you went to school. You were then went off to study civil engineering at Queen's. When does politics enter your life? Is it a family ambition or is it something that entirely pops up spontaneously?
No, it certainly wasn't a family ambition. My family weren't at all political, and we had no one involved in politics at all in the family. But I think growing up in the 70s and 80s, it was impossible not to be affected by politics, or at least the failure of politics. And so it was all around me all the time. And I suppose I became political in the sense that I had an interest in what was going on, but I have to say most of it just depressed me, and I never would have considered studying politics or getting involved in politics or anything like that when I was growing up. So I suppose from my point of view, politics kind of impacted on me in two ways. First of all, I went to university, and that was my first experience of integrated education, I guess, for want of a better description, because up until then I'd lived in a very predominantly unionist area of the city. That had been my experience in terms of school and education and everything else. And when I went to Queen's, suddenly I was confronted with people from all over Northern Ireland, from different backgrounds, from people from all over this island and indeed further afield. All of us studying the same subject, all of us basically wanting many of the same things. And I suppose it sort of challenged my views and kind of opened me up to more diversity. But also I just had a practical problem when I was at university. I say a practical problem, I got a grant, as we all did in those days, which doesn't seem like a problem. But my mother retired just before I went to university, so I was essentially the only earner in the house. And I had a difficulty with my grant, and I'd gone to local politicians for help. And one of them came back and helped me out, and it was John Alderdice, who was my local councillor.
So is that because lots of people, Naomi, who grew up in the 70s and the 80s were, I suppose, you didn't say the word radicalized, but I suppose it is, you are sort of shaped by the world around you. They were pushed in a very different direction, especially growing up in a predominantly Protestant East Belfast. Was that your first introduction then to the Alliance Party? Was John Alderdice?
No, I mean, I actually sang in the church choir with his PA, and it was her that suggested asking him. I'd seen Alliance on the news. It was like everyone else. I was aware they were there. They seemed to be decent enough people. They just weren't particularly popular where I grew up, as you can imagine. And so that was kind of my initial experience. I reached out to a number of politicians, including my MP at the time, and they didn't get back to me, and John did, and he got it sorted in a couple of days. And that was the first experience, I suppose, I had of politics actually achieving something. It's a very minor thing, but for me it was significant. And so I didn't really think anything more about it until I graduated, and it was 1994. So the first ceasefires had just started. It was really the first time in my life that there seemed to be some hope that things might change. And I was making decisions about my future, whether I was going to stay in Northern Ireland or whether I was going to go away and find a job elsewhere. And I made a very conscious choice that I wanted to stay, but that if I was going to stay, I wanted to be part of trying to change Northern Ireland, because I could see things were not right. The way we lived, divided society, those things really bothered me. And so I wasn't sure what I would do in terms of contributing, but I decided I would stay. And I was canvassed at a subsequent election, and the gentleman who came to my door asked me if I consider voting Alliance. And by then I was more familiar with what they stood for. And I said, yeah, I would actually, because I think that you are doing in microcosm what I would like Northern Ireland to do, and that you're bringing people together from different backgrounds and you're doing something constructive. And so I joined the party, and that was in around 1995, 96. But I never intended to be a politician. That was not my ambition. I just wanted to give them a fee every year for membership and let them crack on and make everything right. And I would continue to be an engineer.
Yeah. Well, you were a civil engineer for a decade. Is there a value, Naomi, to people in politics having a prior career like that? I mean, do you think that those 10 years of your life have shaped the political animal, the political person that you are in the years subsequent?
Yeah, I think so. I think, first of all, I think partly because of my upbringing, my dad died when I was quite young. I've always had an interest in how things work, because I kind of took over the DIY around the house and all that kind of stuff when he passed away. So I've always been kind of quite a practical person. And I think being an engineer has done a number of things. There are a lot of transferable skills, but I think some of the key ones for me is just about being a problem solver. I come to things and look and say, here's the problem, how do we fix it? I get frustrated at times with other people who are great at the abstract concept, but aren't great at the how do we fix it? What are we going to do? And that's the bit of it that motivates me. I want to see action and delivery. So I think that's part of it. I also think just in terms of managing time and big projects and things like that, it's good experience in terms of engineering. But also people tend to think of engineers as being people who are behind desks and not really dealing with the public. But a lot of my time, I did the master's course in engineering at Queen's. So a lot of your time is spent looking at how you interact with things like public inquiries and present things to people and explain projects to the public who maybe don't have the same grasp of the technology. Yeah. And I think all of that's been really useful in politics in terms of distilling complex ideas and thoughts into simple but still accurate descriptions to be able to communicate them to the public.
Well, there's an advertisement for civil engineering there.
Absolutely.
Queen's will take that clip. Let's jump forward then to politics. So elected Belfast City Council 2001, then into the Assembly in 2003, and then deputy leader of the Alliance Party in 2006. So I mean, in 5 years, you went from being an ordinary citizen, I suppose, to a very senior MLA. Was that a whirlwind for you? Was it too fast looking back? I mean, do you have any regrets about moving as quickly? Would you prefer to be slower? Do you remember much about those 5 years?
No, I mean, I suppose I kind of fell into politics by accident. So I only ran for Belfast City Council because I was promised that I wouldn't get elected. So it wasn't a conscious choice that I suddenly wanted to be a councillor, and I didn't have a 5-year plan, and I never have. It isn't how I work. But when I ran, I knew I had to be able to do the job if I got elected. I just wasn't expecting that I would, but I was. And things got pretty rough pretty quickly, because at that time the big debate in Belfast was whether Sinn Féin would be Lord Mayor of Belfast at some point or not. And I was jettisoned into that, dropped into a situation where we held the balance of power. There were 3 of us in Alliance who held that balance, and we made the decision effectively in terms of who would get the post. And so, you know, a year after being elected to the council, I got my first death threat. And that, I have to say, was kind of brought me up short. But when I thought about it, and that was a point where I could have decided not to become...
surely a death threat's the time when you go, that's it for me. I'm not going to go on to become an MLA and then an MP and then an MP.
Well, I think that was the intention of those who issued the death threat. I think they just misjudged the audience, because I'm afraid I'm quite a stubborn person. And the idea that somebody would tell me what I could and couldn't do just didn't sit comfortably with me. But it also, for me, it really made me think, well, look, when it comes to politics, I got involved because I thought there was something wrong with our society. There clearly still is. So surely that's a motivator for me to be more involved, not less. So if anything, it actually motivated me to get more involved. And that was the point when I then ran for the Assembly and became an MLA. So, I mean, yes, in some ways it was a shock to get a death threat, but at the same time, it kind of motivated me and made me think, no, there's still work to do, and that's what I went on to do.
And it
And
wouldn't
then
be
I
your
guess
it wouldn't be your last death threat, unfortunately, Naomi, and I
no,
want to talk in a
no, I
minute or
have
two
quite the
about
collection now.
yeah. Do you keep them as it goes?
No,
All right, okay.
but you remember each one of them,
Yeah,
I can assure
I'm
you.
sure. I want to talk about, the other big controversy that you were sort of that Alliance was involved in anyway, the city council. But before we get there, so deputy leader of the party, and then forward to 2010. In the 2010 general election, you delivered a shock result against the DUP leader and MP for over 30 years, Peter Robinson. You had obviously been working, in that constituency for a number of years. Can you say with all honesty that you expected to win in 2010, or was it as much a shock to you as it was for the pundits?
We knew when we started to canvass that something was happening on the doorsteps. You could tell there was a momentum starting to build, but we expected at the start of the campaign to come second. That was our ambition in some ways. In the previous general elections, we'd always been third, and we thought if we can overtake the Ulster Unionists, there's a real opportunity for us the next time. So, I mean, it wasn't that we hadn't thought about the possibility, but we weren't necessarily expecting it in that election. But we did know once we started talking to people, and this is where canvassing becomes so critical, because we started to realise there's something happening. And we could tell that there was a change in the atmosphere. People had become very jaded. There was a lot of scandal in politics at the time. People had become very frustrated. I was Lord Mayor of Belfast and had been having quite a positive term in office, and had been working the constituency really hard, for the last number of years. And I think there was just a momentum that started to build, and it became very much, and I think Peter Robinson actually partly tried to frame it as a two-horse race between myself and him, because he thought it would help him, because he thought it would split the vote with the Ulster Unionists, and that I wouldn't get enough to get in, but that they wouldn't get enough to beat him either. But it didn't pay off, because
I mean, it's clear, Naomi, that you've been building support, and you can look at the stats there through the elections through the 2010s in that constituency, and people don't vote for people unless they support them and believe in them. I wonder though, you increase your vote share by a massive 25%. How much of that, and there clearly is some of it to be put down to the allegations of financial corruption and the kind of tawdry revelations about the Robinson family. How much, if you had to put a percentage, is people believed in Naomi and the Alliance project, and how much of it is people were just not happy with the kind of scandals that were happening in politics?
Well, I think Peter losing the seat was down, I think, a lot to him and this everything that was going on around him. But me winning it was down to Alliance. So it's not as simple as saying that everything was about that, because the natural successor would have been an Ulster Unionist candidate to take him out. So the fact that we overtook the Ulster Unionists and beat the DUP, you can't say that just happened because he was in a bad way. There were reasons why people chose to bypass the Ulster Unionist candidate, a good candidate too, Trevor Ringland. I mean, he wasn't a bad candidate at all, but they bypassed him and came and voted for me. So I think you've got to give credit to the party and to what we were doing in East Belfast at the time, as well as recognising that, yes, I mean, some of the lack of interest people had in him definitely was spawned by his lack of interest in the constituency, the scandal, the other stuff that was going on. But it wasn't all that. That wouldn't have delivered a win for me. That would have delivered him losing the seat to whoever his main rival was. And at that time, very clearly, people thought it was the Ulster Unionists.
Okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in that way. You were then in the House of Commons for 5 years until 2015. When a unionist pact did help to oust you in 2015. Did you like the House of Commons?
I did. I really enjoyed it. I hated getting there and getting home. It was awful. The traveling was punishing, but I really enjoyed the work. And I found things that, it's like any place, there's a massive amount of work that goes on, a lot of speed to what happens. So I found the things that really mattered to me, and I focused on those. I was on the Northern Ireland Affairs Select Committee. I was also very involved in work around religious freedom and human rights. I was engaged in a lot of work around women and girls, around international development, and then as well as the kind of traditional Northern Ireland stuff that we've been involved in. There's obviously that stuff around welfare reform was really live when I was there, because that bill was going through. So there was a lot of meat to get stuck into.
There's some people that we've spoken to, I think particularly from the devolved nations and regions, who really don't like Westminster. They go, why am I going down? This there's kind of, or you get people who go, no, I liked being, there and able to influence things in that way. I mean, did you prefer it to the Northern Ireland Assembly, for example?
It's really hard to say. I suppose if I had to pick one that I thought was more rewarding, I would say my time in Belfast City Council, bizarrely, was one of the most rewarding, because you make a decision one month and it's implemented the next month. So there's an immediacy to what you do. Someone comes to you with a problem, you can get it fixed. When you start to do parliamentary work, you're talking about legislation, you're talking about shaping things in a much longer term, and it can be quite frustrating. Between the Assembly and Westminster, I mean, Westminster is a kind of place apart. It's a very unusual place to be in many ways. I didn't really get sucked into the culture of it as such, but I enjoyed the work and I enjoyed what I was doing, and I had a good team around me. The Assembly can be frustrating. It really can. I was in Westminster in an odd time because we had a coalition government. So I was the only Liberal in opposition, because every other Liberal was in government. And I'm glad I wasn't, I have to say. It was just...
Were there ever discussions, alliances affiliated with the Lib Dems? Were there ever discussions about you being in coalition? Or maybe...
Actually, at one stage there was a discussion about a rainbow coalition when the initial elections came in, and I had phone calls from the Conservatives, and I had phone calls also from Labour, and Labour were trying to build a rainbow coalition, including the Liberal Democrats, the Greens Alliance, and I said, look, this is not going to hold for 5 years, and actually I think the country needs stability. And I don't think it will hold, but there were discussions that happened. I just don't think I could have gone into government with the Conservatives. I looked at their agenda and their policies and where they were headed, and to me they just didn't sit comfortably with me as a Liberal person. I don't think that they are sensitive to Northern Ireland issues in the way that I would like them to be, and I wouldn't have been comfortable in that. I understand, actually, and I kind of respect why the Lib Dems did what they did going into government, because, I mean, when we had the choice here in the Northern Ireland Assembly at the start of this mandate, we went in largely to try to create stability. So I do understand that motivation. But for me as an individual from Alliance, I felt that I could make a better and more valuable contribution, actually, as an opposition MP, free to speak out and to do what I wanted to do rather than be guided around policy from the government.
There's an interesting dichotomy there, Naomi. I wonder, I mean, on one hand, you're saying you thought the country needed stability, and on the other hand, you're saying you didn't want to see the Tories in power. Why then were you adverse to that rainbow coalition that the Labour Party were putting forward?
I wasn't averse to it. I just didn't feel it would hold, and in the end they reached the same conclusion. It would have required the DUP, it would have required the SNP, Plaid Cymru, the whole gamut to be on board. It was literally going to take every single vote in the House, and at that stage I just felt, given the nature of politics, what you could have ended up with are very small minority interests actually having undue influence over general policy. And I think that there's a danger when that happens. We've seen it with the DUP when they were kind of the tail that wagged the Tory dog for a while over Brexit. It's not a healthy situation. And even if you agree with the people who are doing it at the time, there'll come another time when the group of people who have that level of influence are using it for purposes that aren't appropriate. So I was nervous about
a huge amount of power, I suppose, in that. I mean,
I was nervous about it. I didn't reject it out of hand, but it never came about. But there were a lot of conversations about whether it would happen. But I was nervous about it because I genuinely was fearful that what we would end up with is a government that kind of stumbled along maybe for a year, maybe a year and a half, and collapsed. And I've been through enough messy collapses of government in Northern Ireland, frankly, to last me a lifetime. I actually think a 5-year term government is a good thing. I think a bit of stability in government is a good thing. I think one of the areas, obviously I didn't particularly want the coalition, but having seen what the Conservative Party is like when it isn't in coalition, I much preferred the coalition to what we have at the moment. But from my point of view, as I say, when I was contacted by Labour, I said to them I was up to have the conversation, but that I was concerned that we might end up in a very unstable position. And I do worry about the impact that has on the country in terms of business and economy and all the other things. So
who contacted you before we move on?
There were a couple of people from Labour, Sean Woodward and a few others. He had been the Secretary of State at in the kind of outgoing time. I'd spoken to some people further up the food chain who had also been asking about this and who were testing the water. But it was one of those prospects that I think there were a lot of people in Labour who just did not want the Conservatives in government, understandably. But I think realism dawned that they were the largest party and therefore had to be given a chance to form a government. And I think the Lib Dems in the end were the ones who said that they couldn't see that they could get a deal with Labour that was going to actually hold for a full term. But I certainly wasn't going to consider going into coalition with the Conservative Party because I wouldn't have had any influence. Actually, I had more influence working on the opposition benches. But what I was able to do from the opposition benches was build good relationships with the team that were there on the front bench at the time, and actually get some things delivered, which matters. Because I think, you've got to be able to use your power wherever you have it, whether it's soft power or whether you're actually in government.
Let's jump back to Belfast because I want to cover a couple of things before we get onto the questions because they're in lots of random different areas. I want to kind of move forward then to the next thing after that election. Suddenly, flag protests. So this is the big flag debate in City Hall, which I'm sure is one of your favourite subjects to talk about. It was probably the first piece of Northern Irish politics that I ever noticed as a child, which is what an introduction, I suppose. When Alliance, and you were clearly, at least in some way, involved as being deputy leader, when Alliance planned and voted that motion, which was, in effect, it restricted the number of days that the Union flag could fly down to 18, did you have any idea of what was coming?
We knew it wouldn't be popular. So, I mean, there's no question of that. But you've got to look at it in context. So we'd had a similar vote about 2 years after I was elected. So about 2003, I think that we had a vote on this, and we had voted for, it was voted through committee. And just to explain briefly, things were decided in committee. They then come to the council for ratification. And if your amendment falls, then they go as they stand. So it was voted in committee. There was a majority of unionists in committee. They said the flag would stay 365. It was brought to council. Sinn Féin proposed the flag be removed completely. They then proposed 2 flags on the building. That was voted down fairly substantially. And we proposed in principle that it should be flown on designated days. And 4 people voted for that. 3 Alliance councillors and Billy Hutchinson from the PUP. And everyone else voted against, so it didn't happen. So I'd been through the whole turmoil of this before. And when it came round again, the numbers in City Hall had changed. So the committee that was in charge actually had a Sinn Féin majority. So the decision that came to council was there would be no flag on City Hall. And unless that was amended, that's what would happen. So we didn't actually expect that our amendment would be supported, because we expected that Sinn Féin would go for the default position, which was that the flag in the committee would not fly. We weren't going to support that. Unionists weren't going to support that. And because we held the balance of power, there would just be no decision on the flag at all.
Why wouldn't you have supported it?
Well, because I don't believe that it is right that we would have no flag flying on City Hall. I think we have to, if we're serious about the Good Friday Agreement, we have to accept what that means in constitutional terms, and it means that Northern Ireland is part of the UK. I think that means that we have to be willing to respect the normal protocols that go along with that.
But the flag being up or down wouldn't change the constitutional position.
It doesn't change the constitution, but it's an expression. It's an expression.
That Alliance, as a constitutionally neutral party, could easily have stood over there not being a flag at all.
Well, we could have, but we looked first of all at the equality impact assessment, and we looked at the legal opinion as to what was legally defensible. And it was very clear to us from the equality impact assessment and the legal assessment that the right decision actually was to say designated days. And I think it's really important, and we've seen this before, where unionists are in control of a council, the flag flies on everything from the local dump right through to every civic building, and it's abused in many cases. And when you go then to nationalist councils, the flag doesn't fly at all. And so if you are a unionist and if you're a minority in either of those councils, your views are not respected. And I think it's really important that we do respect it. And sovereignty, the flag and sovereignty do have a link. And so for me, it isn't about flying the flag to annoy people, but it's about flying the flag in a way that is respectful and reflects how it's flown in the rest of the UK. So I think it should be flown on on the main public building, so the main council building only. It should be flown there on designated days as prescribed in UK legislation, same as we do at the Assembly, which actually was agreed recently with no fuss at all. But there were reasons why there was a huge outcry about it.
So then, I mean, what followed now was weeks of protests and riots, the remnants of which would carry on for a year and beyond. During that time, you, other Alliance Party representatives, sent death threats. We've talked about bullets, houses, offices attacked, cars burnt, petrol bombs attacking police officers, the whole thing. I wonder then, in the context of what you've just said, did you feel that, because what you've just described is in some way there was an option, which was no flag, and Alliance intervened to ensure that there would be a flag on 18, however many days it is. Did you then feel that you were the wrong people to be criticised on the basis that it was because of your emotion that the flag would fly at all?
Well, I think that bit completely eluded most unionists, and there's a good reason for that, because unionist parties were aggrieved that I had won the seat. The DUP were annoyed that I had taken the seat from Peter Robinson, and so they instigated quite a vicious leaflet campaign. Over 40,000 leaflets were circulated. They whipped up a lot of fear and tension. They highlighted the fact that Alliance had torn it down, actually, without the support of Sinn Féin and the SDLP for the flag flying on designated days. The flag would either not have been there at all, which is the most likely outcome if we had gone down the no flag route, or it would have continued to fly 365, and a legal case would have been taken because there was one pending, and the legal advice was it would have to be reduced either to 0 or designated days.
So the same loyalists that they would then over a number of years issue with death threats and things, they could actually thank you that the flag was there at all.
Well, I've never expected, I've never expected thanks but yeah, I mean, it wouldn't have been there had it not been for Alliance putting the position forward. And what I actually expected a little bit was a pushback in Republican neighbourhoods, because Sinn Féin for the first time voted in favour of the Union flag flying anywhere. And that was completely lost in the hysteria around the fact that we would only fly the flag on designated days. And that to me was bewildering, because I actually thought, and they thought, in fairness, that they would have a really hard sell in their own constituency. But the thing became so hyped up around unionism and the flag not flying 365 that Sinn Féin walked away from that unscathed, despite the fact that actually, to some degree, it was a victory for unionism, because it was the first time Sinn Féin had ever really acknowledged physically sovereignty of the UK in Northern Ireland in the form of the flag.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, I wonder, during that period of time, you had security for some of that time, as well, as I understand. Was that a scary number of months? Did you ever really feel like, you know, your life was in danger, or is there a kind of, you know, distance that's applied to those kind of things?
No, I felt it was definitely dangerous. I mean, my car was attacked while I was in it. We had missiles thrown at us. My office was burned twice. You know, it was an uncomfortable time. There's no question about that. It's never nice to get death threats at all, but you know, when the police turn up at your door in the middle of the night and basically tell you that if you stay in your own home or you go to your place of work, you'll be shot, it's not a comfortable thing to hear. And it was a fairly unpleasant time, I think, for all of us. There was, though, within the party, and despite all of the pressure, and some people really, you know, were put through hell. Their houses were attacked, and also, I mean, it was just every day in the news there was something else. There was a real sense of, there was a real sense that people pulled together in the party. So although it was a time when we were under attack from outside, the sense of team, the sense of us being like a family who were really pulled together, was really strong. And I think that's one of the things that kind of kept us going during that period, because we had that sense that we were in it together, that we'd done the right thing, and that we just kept going. So, you know, despite the fact that there were threats out there, I continued to hold surgeries, even though the police had to come and sit outside them to make sure that, you know, that things were safe. I continued to go out and canvass, even though we had to have plainclothes police kind of following us around and observing us canvassing and so on. But it was just really important to me that I didn't allow the people who wanted to disrupt my representation to be able to do that. It was challenging, but I mean, I think it was important, and we knew it was going to be difficult. But I think it's really important as a politician that just because there's going to be difficult fallout and consequences for you personally, that you don't let that colour your vision in terms of what decisions you take, because otherwise then you're open to any kind of influence, and it's no longer about principles, it's just simply about pleasing yourself.
Let's talk about, I want to talk about two other things briefly, your leadership and then the so-called alliance surge. And then I want to get onto the questions that we have and some of the people in the call. You took over as alliance leader then in 2016, a decade after being elected as a deputy leader. Did you ever think, oh, I just wish David Ford would go? You know, a bit of the sort of Prince Charles thing. It's been, 10 years in the deputy leadership is a very long period of time to be second in command.
No, not in the slightest. I had plenty of things to be doing, and I actually was, it would be fair to say that I kind of encouraged David to stay much longer than he might have wanted, because I was very keen that we didn't rush transition, and I wanted him to stay on. And to be honest, if he hadn't made the decision himself that he wanted to step back, I think he'd still be there now, because I don't think anybody was dissatisfied or waiting for him to go or anything like that. I was quite happy in the role I was in. I enjoyed what I was doing, and to me, it was never I didn't aspire to be leader, let's put it that way. I did the deputy leader because it was a service, it was an active service to the party. And then when David stepped down, people came to me and asked me if I would run for the leadership. And there was an expectation that I would, but I hadn't been sitting at home for years thinking, oh, I just want to be leader.
You could be forgiven if you had been. I want to talk about then, I mean, your leadership and how it's differed from predecessors. This is one of these questions that asked of all political sort of people. What was different about your leadership, and what has been different about your leadership as opposed to other leaders of the Alliance Party? And I don't mean that as trying to get you to criticize other people. Clearly, every single time a leader takes over a party, they have different priorities. What was it that you changed and have changed, over the course of being Alliance leader? You know, what is Longism for what it's for?
I don't think there is a Longism. I think it's all basically alliance. I don't think that I changed direction after David went. I don't think that's a fair reflection. We were very much a team, and you know, Stephen was very much part of that team even then, you know, because he was kind of deputy leader in the assembly and he was a minister while I was the deputy leader of the party. And so I don't think there's a massive change of direction in that sense. I think we were in a different place. I felt that based on our electoral performance, a lot of David's time in leadership, if you look back at the time he spent, was in trying to rebuild a party that had taken a real hit during Sean Neeson's leadership in particular, where there was a sense in the public mind that, well, what's Alliance for and what's the purpose? And it wasn't that Sean wasn't a good leader, he was a great elected representative, but people thought with the Good Friday Agreement and so on, well, maybe we don't need the Alliance Party anymore, maybe we're okay to just work with unionism and nationalism in the Assembly and everything will be hunky-dory. And I think David kind of, when he took over, managed to re-establish what the party was for and what it was about in a very different time. For me, it was about saying, okay, where are we now? So a lot of what David did was about targeting our resources in elections to make sure that we would keep seats, that we would kind of build a little bit, but it was mainly building in that urban Belfast area. And I suppose my thing when I came into the party as leader was that I wanted to expand. And I said very clearly, we've got to at some point take a risk, and that means moving resources outside our core areas to try and build in rural Northern Ireland, to try and build in Derry, to try and build in those places where we haven't had representation for a long time. We have to focus on growth. We have to focus on membership. We have to focus on getting elected representatives from those areas, not parachuting people in for an election, but actually people who live and work in that area and want to work in
So
politics.
that was, I mean, again, I don't want to get into kind of, oh, David didn't do this right, but you came into the leadership and thought to yourself, I want to focus resources on expansion rather than kind of holding what you already have.
Yeah, I mean, it was a different time. As I say, David was building up from the party being in a very weak position, and it was absolutely the right decision that he made to make sure that resources were targeted. I still believe in target resources, and so, you know, if I had been leading the party when he was leading the party, I would have done what he did. So it's not that there's a change of direction. I think I came to the party at a time when we were on the cusp, and we could either continue to focus on building little by little in the immediate areas where we were strong, or we could take some risks and we could say, okay, if we're really going to do this, we're going to have to really push out. And I made a decision that we should push out, and that we should try to build across Northern Ireland and do that proactively. I spent a lot of my time doing that, going out, working with associations and other things and rebuilding in those areas where we hadn't been so strong, simply because I felt that we were in a position where it was a risk, but it wasn't as big a risk as it would have been maybe 5 years beforehand. That we could still hold our own in the areas that we held, and still give resource to other places.
Let's jump forward then, I suppose, to what some people call, well, the Alliance surge. Very good results in 2019 locals, Euros and generals. How much of that, Naomi, is anti-Brexit sentiment, and how much of it is a deeper identification with the Alliance Party?
Well, I think there's a bit of both, but I don't think the anti-Brexit sentiment in its own would again, you know, explain the shift to alliance. I mean, the SDLP are credibly anti-Brexit, Sinn Féin are credibly anti-Brexit. The Ulster Unionists at one point claimed that they were anti-Brexit.
Yeah, but clearly, I mean, Unionists in particular would be much more comfortable with voting for the Alliance Party to exercise their anti-Brexit vote than they would either Sinn Féin or SDLP.
But the places where we've made inroads are not just in unionist areas and unionist constituencies. We've also made significant inroads in areas that would traditionally have voted in greater numbers for nationalist politicians. So that doesn't really follow through. It's not that people had no other options. People who it was anti-Brexit sentiment alone could have voted SDLP and Sinn Féin, but they didn't. They switched. And so I think that there's an issue about two things. I think the first is that Alliance had, to some degree, caught a little bit of the mood that people had around frustration with the slow movement of politics, because we are frustrated that we're still doing everything around two communities when actually Northern Ireland's much more complicated and diverse than that. I think it also picked up on our frustration with the fact that the Assembly had collapsed, that we weren't able to get any progress made, that there were big issues that we need to fix and big decisions that need to be taken. And the best that we could do was, you know, two parties fighting each other outside with placards and nothing happening in the building. So I think all of those things contributed to it. And Brexit was part of that. But Brexit to us was more about saying, it was more a symptom of the dysfunction than anything else. And that's, for me, what it still represents. I think the reaction to Brexit, the decisions around Brexit, are a symptom of the dysfunction in our politics, because to me, it just shows how little consideration is given to the detail and the substance, and how much of it is just a sales pitch. And I think we really need to grasp that. And I think people saw with what we were doing that there was detail and substance to the arguments that we were making. And I think that attracted people. I do think society is changing.
Part of my question, though, Naomi, and I want to finish up mine now and go to Mark and to Cormac in a second. Part of my question is, if in the next number of elections Alliance doesn't increase its vote share, or if its vote share was to dip, is that because the moment in time had passed? And that, you know, that the furore of Brexit and the Stormont being down, is it because that had passed, or is it because support really had dipped for the Alliance Party?
Well, I think from my point of view, what we have to do, every political situation is an opportunity for you to show who you are and what you're about. So whatever the crisis might be, whether it's COVID or whatever else it might be, it's an opportunity for you to show your values to the public. So if people decide en masse that they've had enough of alliance, then that'll be down to how we performed, and we can't kind of blame it on circumstance in that sense. But I think the evidence that we see is that that is being sustained, that growth is being sustained, both in terms of our membership, but also in terms of polling. The evidence is that that surge is continuing. I don't take it for granted, because anything can happen between now and next year. We need to do the work on the ground to be able to connect with people. And I think that personable end of politics is really important. But yeah, I mean, you've got to take responsibility for what happens, for what your fortunes are. Yes, circumstances play a part in it, but it can't all be circumstances. And I think people are always trying, and have always tried when Alliance does well, to explain away the reasons why we do well. And so I think this time, because the improvement in our fortunes has been somewhat more sustained, it's a bit harder to do. I like to think, for the sake of Northern Ireland, that actually what we're seeing is a real change in terms of how people view politics. And I think if that's what we're seeing, then that's a breakthrough, because there's an opportunity to really make dramatic changes at the Assembly if we end up as as one of the top three parties. That changes the dynamics.
Let's try to get some questions in, Naomi. So I think Mark and Cormac, we'll go to Mark first, and we'll try to sort of, because we've got lots on a variety of different topics. Some I'm sure you'll be expecting, some of them are a bit more random, to be honest. So Mark, why don't you ask Naomi your question? I think we can hear you and see you. Yes.
Hi, Naomi. It's a pleasure speaking with you. In the LitTalk, we have this running gag. After a debate, we go to a voter speaker building, and we get to the abstaining vote, and there'll usually be somebody in the room who pipes up and says, "Oh, here come the Alliance brothers." For many, Alliance is defined by its position on the constitutional question. And I'm sure we could agree that green and orange issues play far too large a role in our politics. But in the wake of Brexit, rather than diminishing, they seem to be getting more and more important. So my question is, how can you be confident of the future of the party when, for many, these issues seem to be getting more important rather than less?
Well, I think that there's a couple of things. I suppose the constitutional position, we've never said it isn't important. We've said that it shouldn't be the guide to every decision we take. I mean, if you look at decisions in Northern Ireland, if you look at COVID, my goodness, people actually managed to sectarianize COVID. Edwin Poots telling us that it was mainly Catholics, it was their fault that it was being spread and they were catching it at one point. And, all kinds of nonsense being talked. I just think we don't need everything to be a green and orange issue. Of course, the constitutional position will matter, and there will be a point where a decision will have to be taken on that, and we will take a decision on it. But I don't take my decisions based on speculation years in advance. I take my decisions based on evidence at the time. That's how politics ought to be done. And at the moment, there is no proposition. So nobody has come to us with a proposition for what a united Ireland would look like, about how it would be funded, how it would transition, what would we do with the Assembly in the interim, how would we solve community relations, who would take on responsibility for the legacy of the past and all of those complex issues. So when somebody comes with a proposition, or when they want to discuss a proposition, we're engaging in that conversation.
Naomi, though, is it not the job of politicians and political parties to provide leadership? I mean, you're not a voter. Voters wait until others come to them with ideas and they decide which way they're going to go. You're a political party with a significant degree of support. Is there not an onus on you to propose either maintaining the union or transferring to Irish unification?
No, because actually what we're focused on is the prospect of uniting our community. And actually that to me is the fundamental point, that we're not focused on whether it's a united Ireland or the United Kingdom. We want a united community here in Northern Ireland. And when we get to that point where this community is united, then there is a prospect to have a conversation about the wider constitutional position. But we're not united anything while we're segregated in Northern Ireland, and we just need to be honest about that. So from my point of view, that's my priority. Other people have different priorities. I'm not dismissing them. If you want to build your entire priorities in politics around the constitutional question, that's fine. And there are lots of other parties for you, and lots of other parties will do that. That's not my priority. It isn't what gets me out of bed in the morning. It isn't what motivates my colleagues. What motivates us is trying to build a united community, trying to build a shared society, one that is fair and equitable and treats people with respect and dignity. Now, I think there's a lot of work still to do in that. When that work is done, then Alliance will have finished its job.
Okay, let's get a question from Cormac on something similar. Cormac, I think if you switch on your camera. There's Cormac. Yeah, Cormac, we can see you. Okay. Pose your question, Cormac.
Hello, Naomi.
Hi.
Thanks for speaking with us this evening. So, as you will know, of course, in 2017, the European Council confirmed that in the event of a successful border poll and the reunification of Ireland, the North will automatically re-enter the EU in line with the rest of Ireland. And of course, as everyone will know, Alliance is a very, very pro-EU party. So my question to you is then, surely it makes sense for Alliance to support a border poll and Irish unity, if not because of the constitutional issue itself, but as a means, probably the most direct and effective means for us to regain our EU membership, particularly considering that there is clearly no appetite in Britain for performing a U-turn on Brexit. So I guess my question is, is this a case of the Alliance Party's ostensible neutrality and partition trumping your EU credentials? So yeah, basically does not make sense for Alliance to support Irish unity as a means to re-enter the EU. Thank you.
No, I mean, I understand where you're coming from. I mean, first of all, I wouldn't rule out that there'll be a change of direction in the rest of the UK, because they're only now starting to see their figures for the first quarter in terms of exports and imports, and it's not a pretty picture. So, I think that we may find increasing alignment with the EU, because people are realizing that actually the replacement deals that they've been cutting all over the world are just that, replacement deals to the ones they had in the EU, but they've actually squandered a lot of capital with their existing best market. And I think that's...
Do you really think that the UK might go back into the European
Union? At one point, yeah, I do. I think that the direction of travel in terms of the EU, it's intractable, because you need to be able to be part of a bigger bloc in order to trade. I don't think they'll rejoin the EU, but I think they will align more closely than they are at the moment. And I think that's setting that aside. In terms of re-entering the EU, of course, I would love to be part of the EU properly again and be back in that space. But I think we need to look at the issue of the constitutional position of Northern Ireland through the lens of the Good Friday Agreement. And that, I always come back to that because I think it's really important. And there are a couple of things that it requires. It requires us, I think, first of all, to have a proposition that is going to be feasible. So we're engaging in those conversations with others, and I have attended a number of public discussions and debates around what a united Ireland might look like, because I think it's wise for all of us to be engaged in that conversation, because it may happen. So it's right that we should engage in it. I think that any referendum should be held at a time when Stormont is stable and functioning. That was how it was envisaged in the Good Friday Agreement. And it should be held at a time when there is a prospect that change will happen. And at the minute, that isn't absolutely clear. So I think there's a judgment to be made as to when you have the referendum. And I mean, I've been talking to other colleagues about this as well. I'm not opposed to there being a referendum, but I do think that rushing to a referendum when you don't have a plan, we saw what happened with Brexit. Having a referendum without any concept of what would lie at the other side of it was a disaster.
No, I mean, the policy
I would be very opposed to a referendum taken in a position where it was in a vacuum with no structure and no plan as to how we were going to move forward.
No, I mean, that policy, though, is that not very similar, I mean, to what the SDLP would say on this question? And they're a nationalist party and they're advocating for Irish unification. You could do the same thing on the basis that you're after EU membership again, just because you don't want.
But we're not advocating.
Okay.
But we're not advocating for it. That's the point. We're not advocating for Irish unity. We're advocating for a united Northern Ireland. And I know that this bugs people because they desperately need to put people in a box in Northern Ireland. They believe that we're secretly under the surface all either a unionist or a nationalist. It's just not true. There are a growing number of people who don't see the world through that lens, who will have a position when the vote comes and who will take a position when the vote comes. but they're not interested in having that debate ad infinitum right at this point in time when there are other things that are more important.
And I want to move on now,
that's a valid political position to take.
I want to move on to some of those other things, but in fact, we did get a lot of questions on this, so I'll put a final one to you, and then then we'll move on, because I want to move on to something very important. But you know, one of the points that was put to us was, you know, in the world of social justice issues, a lot of people, and I'm sure some Alliance representatives, say stuff like, if you're not against perceived injustice, then you're complicit in its continuation. If Alliance isn't against the union, i.e. advocating for a united Ireland, does that not mean that by definition it's complicit in its continuation for good or for bad, and is therefore a tacitly pro-union party?
No, I mean, again, I've heard that argument, but it's simply not the case. We have accepted the results of the Good Friday Agreement, and we've all signed up to that. And that means that until a majority of people in Northern Ireland choose otherwise, we remain part of the UK, and that we have devolution. It doesn't mean that we can come a point at some point in the future where we may advocate for change if we felt that was right. But at this point in time, I think that the challenge that we have is trying to unite what is a very divided community, not just on sectarian lines, actually, but a very socially divided and economically divided community. And I think there's a huge amount of work we need to do on that. And I'm much more focused on that. That was what drove me to get involved in politics. It wasn't the fear of a united Ireland or the desire to remain in the United Kingdom. Those things are not my priority. And I get that people find it frustrating, but actually I find the focus on unionism and nationalism frustrating, because in so many of the daily jobs that I do, and so many of the things I try to get done, it's destructive and distracting, as opposed to constructive and actually making things happen. Okay. So I would love to see people able to make those decisions at the right time. I have no objection to it. Happy to be in part of the conversation around shaping it. I think everyone should be in that conversation, but realistically at this point in time, it isn't my main priority.
Okay, let's move on to something that other people think maybe should be your main priority. Hannah Campbell and Kirsten Wallace. I think, Hannah, we'll start with you. If you can switch on your camera, unmute yourself. Thank you so much.
Hi, lovely to meet you, Naomi. I am a final year law student and co-founder of Stop Street Harassment, and Kristen is my other co-founder. Just for clarity's sake, when I'm talking about public street harassment, I'm talking about catcalling ranging to public sexual assault. And we are just wondering, with your strategy coming in now on violence against women, what that would mean for street harassment.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I've done a lot of work. I've prioritised issues that affect women and girls in my time in the department. Things like, for example, domestic violence and abuse. We're bringing forward new legislation around serious sexual offences in the next couple of months. Stalking is there as well, and there are a whole range. The legislation and the support around that in itself is gender neutral, and that any victim can use the law and can claim support, but it's gendered in the sense that a disproportionate number of women are affected by those particular crimes. So that's one of the things I've done. I've also looked at a strategy for women and girls in the justice system and so on. But there are a whole series, I think, of other issues that I'm looking at the moment around particularly harassment of women, the difficulties that women have with things like upskirting and downblousing, and so on. We're actually bringing forward, as part of our legislation in May, we're bringing forward new legislation to make those specific offences. At the minute, they're covered broadly by outraging public decency, but I think it's much better if we can make specific offences to make it clear that's not acceptable. There are things at the minute that are hard to prosecute. So, for example, things like street harassment, catcalling, wolf whistling, all of that kind of stuff that can be very intimidating. It can affect how people choose to live their lives and how they make choices about what they're going to do. All of those things, that fear that women have, that men don't understand when you're walking down a badly lit street and you hear footsteps behind you. That thing of walking with your keys in your hand because you don't want to have to stop at the door when you get there and feeling relief when you get in. All women have experienced that, and very few men will understand what that's about. So I think we need to do more than just look at the justice side of this. I think there's an educational issue here. The work that Judge Marinan has done looking at gender as a potential hate crime a category of hate crime, looking at potentially misogyny being a hate crime. I think those are things we need to consider, and we're going to do work on that in the department. But I think more fundamentally, we need to look at education. We need to look at cultural attitudes and how we change those. There is a sense, I think, at times of male entitlement that causes people to think that that kind of behaviour is acceptable. It's a kind of masculinity that actually doesn't serve young men well either. See a lot of young men who believe that being macho and tough is where it's at, and that's how they should be. This is how to show that they're real men. And in actual fact, a lot of them are hurting inside, and their death by suicide is really high amongst young men.
Naomi, so, I want to let Kristen ask a question as well, but we got one from Yasmin here that I think is sort of relevant to this conversation. Naomi, she says, talked about introducing a strategy like the rest of the UK for this kind of inexcusable behaviour, but seeing as though she's been a Justice Minister for over a year, does she not think, being a woman herself, that this should have been a more pressing issue? That's the question from Yasmin. And another similar one we got, and I'll let you answer these kind of in conjunction, Naomi, was lots of people try to say that this is all cultural, and that's right, but there are only 28% of sexual offences made it to trial in Northern Ireland in 2019 to 2020. Is there not a problem with the justice system as well? Your Justice Minister, before we get a question from Kristen there, Wallace.
There are two things. Have we taken too long? I would say no, it has been a priority. And if you look at brought forward by May this year, I'll have brought 5 bills to the Assembly, and 3 of them deal specifically with issues affecting women and girls and violence. And the other committal reform bill deals with a number of issues, including speeding up justice, and the lack of speed in the justice system is one of the reasons why many women, there's a high attrition rate for people bringing forward cases against rape, because women find the wait for the trial actually traumatic. So I don't think you could say I haven't acted in the last year. I think 5 bills is more than any minister has brought to the Assembly in a 5-year term. So just to put it in context, it is a very challenging programme. I've also been working really hard on other issues around the Gillen Review. And yes, cultural change is necessary, but we're also looking very carefully at the structural change. So for example, remote evidence centres have been introduced, and those go live in April, so that women will no longer have to face their abuser in the courtroom in order to give evidence. We're also looking at of ensuring victims' anonymity, so that is better protected in the court. We have introduced requirements for training for everyone in the justice system who deals with cases of sexual assault and rape. So we are tackling the issues in the justice system. We are dealing with, for example, if you look at the issues in the Gillen Review, they're calling very clearly to say that what we need to do is tackle education. So we need to do things like tackle issues around consent, tackle issues around rape myths, and ensure that women are not, we don't get into victim blaming, because that culture needs to change. I suppose the point I'm making is it's not just a justice issue. So what I have brought forward to the executive in terms of a policy suggestion isn't that I lead on a violence against women and girls strategy. We're already doing a lot of things in the department on this, but I actually think this is one for the Department for Communities or for the Executive Office, because this needs to be cross-cutting in the executive. We need to see the Education Minister, the Health Minister, the Communities Minister, all of those ministers need to step up and take responsibility. I'm happy to put my contribution on the table, and I think we've done a pretty good job, but there's more to do.
I'll let Kristen, do you want to speak? You've got the Justice Minister here. You're clearly very involved in this issue yourself. Do you have a question you want to put?
Yeah, well, I'm basically with Hannah here too. I'm the other co-founder of Stop Street Harassment and I just want to say, I know you said you're bringing that paper forward, and that could take a bit of time, and as you say, it's quite hard, and it might not actually be kind of like a justice issue. But what would you kind of advise now that we do in this kind of interim stage? What can we do on the ground right now to kind of bring awareness to this? Because obviously we're championing for street harassment and trying to get the education out there, and we have a platform at the minute. We have it both on Instagram and Twitter, trying to get it out there. And I'm just wondering right now, what can we do to kind of push this forward?
Well, from my perspective, the paper will go to executive for Tuesday, so I issued it today. It's not that we're sitting on it and waiting. It's important to me that this gets done and that we get movement. It's also important that we don't just badge what we're already doing and call it a violence against women and girls strategy. So specifically said that we need to deal with the third sector. So people like yourselves who are campaigning on these issues need to be part of forming the strategy.
Yeah,
I think in terms I think in terms of street harassment and changing culture, there is an issue about calling it out, but not just for women. It's not just for us to say this is unacceptable behaviour. We need allies in this. We need the good men who are out there, who don't catcall, who don't abuse women in the street, to actually step up and say, stop it, it's not acceptable. And unless we get to that point, unless when we say to the police that we were harassed, you know, we're not going to be able to get any reaction. It is difficult because for harassment, for example, to be prosecuted, it has to happen more than once. And we all know that mostly it happens more than once, but not the same person. So that makes it really hard to prosecute.
Part of the problem here, though, Naomi, I wonder, so often in this issue, we're constantly hearing about there's legislation coming and we're going to do something. And it's always, and you've talked already about how in the House of Commons, for example, everything is lengthy. Is there nothing that the Justice Department, for example, government could do to make a material change, you know, tomorrow, the next day, to try to fight this in the short term as well as just the long term?
Well, we have, as I say, even in terms of the justice system, we've intervened and we've already made changes in terms of training for the judiciary and training for those involved in the court system. We've also introduced remote evidence centres so that women won't have to face their abuser when they go to court. We have, I mean, in fairness, in a year we've already passed legislation. I mean, the Domestic Abuse Act is now in law. So, I mean, we have actually got that done in a year. And we actually got it done quicker than Westminster. They were still working on their bill at the moment. Ours is done and is now enacted and has royal assent. So yes, some processes, legislation takes time, but the other stuff that we do in terms of awareness raising, in terms of trying to support groups who are actually out there working with women on the ground to give them support, all of those things we can do without legislative cover. But I think also the cultural change, and I know we keep coming back to this, and it feels like it's a long journey, but actually the cultural change is important, because until we get to a point where, you know, there is genuine respect in our community for women, we're not going to get this problem done away with. And it has to start, in my view, with good RSE education. And so I got the Education Minister to agree to review the minimum core curriculum in order to look at including things like rape myths, like relationships, and looking at things like respect as part of that agenda.
Hannah and Kristen, I wonder, because I want to, this is clearly an important issue, and we have a good few other questions I want to get to, but you know, you've got the Justice Minister here. Naomi, I hope you don't mind. Kristen and Hannah, I wonder if you were, you know, clearly you're at the cold face of this. Do you have a message for Naomi Long about what needs to be done, what the justice system could be doing? I hope you don't mind, Naomi. It's a consultative process.
Absolutely not.
Hannah, why don't we start with you? I mean, you've got the Justice Minister here. What's your message?
Yeah, I suppose just as you say, consultation with groups like ourselves. Like, I know me and Kristen are the only people in Northern Ireland that are speaking on street harassment, and we're spreading education ourselves. Like, we're both 2 students, you know. But I suppose consultation, like, I would love if it's possible to put in the chat box like our email for street harassment, and
please
in future, like, we would love to be contacted if we're in any time and to discuss these things.
Well, look, I would be really keen to do that. I'm actually setting up a meeting at the moment with the people behind Reclaim the Night and some of the work that they're doing, and also with the Rainbow Project around some of the issues that trans women face and so on. So I would be really keen if you could send me, I mean, my email's out there on Twitter and so on in terms of my MLA account, but if you drop me a quick email, I'm more than happy to include you in meetings like that, because I do think there is a genuine issue here that needs to be addressed, and not everything requires a justice response in the courts, but some things do. And I think by highlighting the inequalities that women face in terms of how they're treated and in terms of respect, we can actually start to change things quite dramatically. Things are, believe it or not, better now than they were when I was younger, but they're still not good enough, you know. And it's a very unsettling thing to be a young woman walking home, and then when something happens, you know, people say, why didn't she get a taxi? Why did she walk on her own? Who's to know? Maybe she couldn't afford a taxi. Maybe she was coming home from work. Maybe there isn't always someone around who can walk with you, but it doesn't matter. You should be able to walk the streets on your own. You're not at fault. It's the person who attacks you that's at fault. So I think that there is a real issue here around changing the conversation and getting away from victim blaming and judging people. It isn't a crime to be out at night on your own. And if somebody treats you, of course, we're going to give people good personal security and safety advice. But if someone is on their own at night, they should be safe. And if they aren't safe, there's something wrong with society, and we need to work on that.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, we will. I'm sure we can get an email address to you as well. But that was useful then. A useful. Thank you very much, Kristen.
Sorry, I'm actually just going to put the email into the chat box now, so you can.
Sure, and if you give it to Ryan, I'm sure he can send it as well.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank
you so much, Naomi.
A couple of questions we had in about climate change, Naomi. First, very briefly, how important is climate change to the Alliance Party? And then there's a follow-up question. It's the way that this one is designed. So if you could briefly talk about how important it is, and then there's a follow-up question.
Well, I mean, I think it has to be the main priority for every party. If we don't get this right now, the opportunity for us to be able to bring climate change under control will diminish very rapidly. So we've got to do this now. It requires us to act quickly. It requires us to think differently. And I also think it requires us to grasp the opportunities that lie in the green economy in order that we can still provide jobs and employment and economic growth for people, but do it in a way that is actually sustainable rather than one that damages the planet.
Okay, you've talked about how it's a priority just there. The question is about air passenger duty. We know that flights are a major contributing factor to climate change. In fact, a return flight from Belfast to Orlando would be estimated to melt around 7.8 square metres of Arctic ice. Why has the Alliance Party repeatedly campaigned to abolish air passenger duty, which would incentivise flying, including by appealing directly to the Prime Minister for this tax to be slashed? Why are you campaigning for that?
We didn't campaign to abolish air passenger duty. We campaigned to remove the double air passenger duty that passengers from Northern Ireland face when they have to do essential travel. So we can't at the minute travel to England on business or to anywhere for that matter on business without using flights. So it's a necessary thing when you live on an island, and we have to be balanced about this. So if also we have fewer through carriers, so if you're traveling on to another destination through London, you're more likely to have to change carrier. And as a result of that, you pay air passenger duty twice, whereas somebody making the same journey from Glasgow, for example, on a through carrier by BA, will only pay air passenger duty once. I believe that there is an inequality in that, and that is what we have campaigned for, in order that people here in Northern Ireland are able to do essential business wherever they need to do essential business. But also bear in mind, things have changed dramatically since those campaigns, because that was in 2015. And I worked really hard on trying to remove the double duty issue that there was. I also don't think now there is the same need for people to travel for business purposes. We're sitting having this as a remote meeting. I've been able to have meetings all over Europe over the last year without having to move from my back room. So from that perspective, I think that the culture has shifted, and that will allow us to reduce the amount of business travel. But we do have to. Would you still
be in favour of reducing whatever air passenger duty people in Northern Ireland have to pay?
It should be fair, yes. It should be fair. So we should not have.
The problem is now when people look at that and say any reduction in air passenger duty is incentivizing flying, and flying is damaging the environment.
I think that's a mistake, because we aren't saying that people should fly, but we are saying that when people do fly, people ought to be paying a fair amount for their flights.
But reducing prices on stuff incentivizes it.
Well, it doesn't incentivize it, because necessary business travel, necessary travel by definition can't be incentivized. Necessary means you have to do it. So if somebody has to travel for work purposes, they're going to have to do it whatever it costs. And so putting the price up simply has an implication for business and an impact on on affordability. So from our perspective, that was what the argument was about. It was a very strong case. In the end, the government was actually looking at slashing air passenger duty more widely. That's not a view that I take. Also, it's worth looking at the research, because actually air passenger duty is no longer linked to the amount of damage that the flights do to the environment. It's simply, and the government would admit this, it's simply a tax that is placed on air travel, but it isn't invested at all in any kind of approach to try and improve the environment. So it's not a green tax. What it is an easy way to get money out of people's pockets, a bit like VAT, but it isn't a proportionate tax. So we have we have a number of policies around taxation in Alliance, including that there should be more income-based taxes rather than property and wealth-based taxes, because I think that's important. But I think in terms of our passenger duty, I still think it should be fair and equitable for people who live on this island to be able to do business elsewhere. Okay. But I do think we're in the middle at the moment of our review of policy. Our Green New Deal policy is going to be launched in the next number of months. And one of the areas that we have reviewed in light of the pandemic and in light of the growing climate change is around our travel and our connectivity. Okay. So we'll see new policies emerge in that space over the next number of weeks.
Another question that was in relation to tax that I want to link in here as well. This person actually got a quote from your appearance, an interview you did with the Federation of Small Businesses at the 2012 Alliance Party conference. Somebody was digging. You said, we have to recognize that, quote, if you grow the pie and you take a smaller slice of the pie, overall you can end up getting more. You were talking in relation to corporation tax. Is that Alliance's approach to tax, which is tax less, bigger pie, you can end up with more?
No, that's not the point that I was saying. It was a very specific issue around corporation tax. In terms of taxation, our policies also set out clearly that it's about income tax base. So we believe that it's right that you're taxed on your income, because that is the least disproportionate way to do it. When you tax on, for example, VAT on your expenses, what you're doing is disadvantaging those on lower incomes. So we have a fairness in terms of tax, and that's how it ought to be, in my view. When it comes to things like corporation tax, there was a major debate in terms of corporation tax back in 2012. And the evidence was that if we were able to match our corporation tax to that in the Republic of Ireland, we would be able to grow our share of direct investment, and that would allow us to generate more tax in terms of actual physical amounts of tax. So there would be more money, but at a lower percentage. So it made sense in terms of the balance to reduce the proportion of the tax, so the percentage of the tax, to have a bigger tax gain, which is what we would have had. I think the balance on that has also shifted. So we've seen, for example, corporation tax in the rest of the UK is now likely to increase. And I think that the issue around corporation tax really died a death, really, during the kind of late 2017, 18, when we saw a big divergence in how different countries were operating their corporation tax. It would no longer be a priority for us in terms of the executive, because I don't think it's affordable, particularly given the recent announcements that we've had from Westminster in terms of the divergent policies on corporation tax. There is a challenge for us, because if you have large tax differentials between North and South, in terms of corporation tax, it is a disadvantage when you try then to get inward investment in Northern Ireland, and we need to reflect on that and look at what else we can offer, which is better and different, that will still attract businesses in.
Okay, we've gone just past the hour mark, but I do have a couple more questions, Naomi, I'd love to put to you that have been sent to us.
Sure.
This first one, is Alliance a pro-choice party?
No, we're not. It's a matter of conscience. I'm pro-choice, but not everybody in the party is.
Is that not an important enough issue to you that you would whip your party to vote a certain way on it?
It's actually because it's an important issue, and one that I think cuts to the very core of people's belief systems. And because I am both a proponent of liberalism and indeed of religious freedom, I think it's important that we allow people to reach their own decisions on that. That has led me to a position where I believe that it's up to the individual woman to make the choice in her own life, and I would be pro-choice. Alliance Youth have adopted a pro-choice position. I think the majority of our membership are pro-choice, but there are some of our members who are not, and I believe it would be wrong to whip somebody against their conscience on an issue of life and death. And that has been long-standing the position of most Western democratic parties, where these things have been left to conscience. And even in Westminster, when we had votes on issues around abortion or around assisted suicide or assisted dying, we were all left to our own devices in terms of there were no party whips applied.
I wonder, though, you talked about how some of your MLAs are in favour, are pro-life, or at least vote in a pro-life way, one of whom voted in favour of the bill restricting access to abortion. I think, was it this week, last week?
This week.
in the Assembly. How does it sit with you that one of your MLAs can vote within the party on a measure that violated the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. How does that sit with you as a leader? Surely,
well, I don't
is that not the
agree.
case when you do intervene?
I don't agree with his position. So Chris is my colleague here in East Belfast, and we've been friends and colleagues for a very long time. I don't agree with his position on this, but I respect his right to take a different view to mine. When it comes to the vote, he voted in order that the debate could continue and that the evidence could be presented to the executive and to the assembly around the issues, particularly around human rights and so on. My personal view is that I think the bill is emotive. I think it is deliberately abusing the position around disability in order to try to chip away at the rights that women have. And so I don't agree with his position. I understand his motivation, but I don't agree with his position.
Okay, let's move on to a question from, we'll do this one quickly, then one on the pandemic. This is from Corshena. Can the minister see the imbalance, says Corshena, of heavy-handed policing in nationalist communities over the recent events with Rangers celebrating compared to the events in the Ormer Road and the Holy Lands this week?
Well, I can't comment on policing issues. It's outside my remit as Justice Minister, and I'm actually bound not to comment on individual policing issues. It's one of the rules of the job, I'm afraid.
Okay, what about more generally then? Let's not.
The police, just to be clear,
the police. With how the PSNI
the police are entirely independent of my office, and I have to respect that independence. And there are checks and balances there through the Ombudsman's office and the policing board to check that. In broad terms, do I think the police have got it right on every occasion? No, I don't. I think, like everyone else, they're having to make some very difficult choices, some very unusual choices, and often under considerable pressure. There are a number of occasions where I think they may well have got it wrong, and indeed the Ombudsman's office and their own human rights advisor have said they got it wrong. But to balance that, they also said and recognised that it was a very difficult situation that they were policing. I don't think it's a matter of them making bad decisions, if you like, based on community background. So, for example, around Black Lives Matters, did they get it right? Well, the Ombudsman and the Human Rights Advisor said no, but they were also very clear that they didn't believe that the difference in approach was driven by racism. And I think that's quite important. In the same way, I wouldn't suggest that it's bias in terms of how the police handle things. I think perhaps there are different people, there's human error, there are lots of things that happen. But I think the best thing, if people have concerns, the best thing to do is to report them to the Ombudsman and allow the Ombudsman to properly investigate.
You don't think that there's a balance based on unionist and nationalist?
Well, look, I would have to see evidence of that before I could comment on it, and I haven't seen that evidence, so it's not something that I could draw. I couldn't draw that conclusion. It would be unfair of me to do so.
Okay, let's try to jump to a question from Keir, who's in the call about COVID, which we haven't really even talked about. I'm always thrilled to say. Keir, if you can unmute yourself, switch on your camera. There we go. Keir, I'll let you put your question to Naomi.
Hi, thanks. My question is, given that in the rest of the UK, especially like in England, they have a timetable for unlocking, albeit they do still go by date and not dates, or so they say. In Northern Ireland, do you not think that there's a very real possibility that because we have none of this timeline, despite having similar infection levels and similar levels of vaccination to the rest of the UK, that businesses in England and Scotland are able to open up whilst we're still in full lockdown here in Northern Ireland?
Least of all hairdressers, Keir, right?
Tell me about it. My hair hasn't been cut since 2019, so I'm getting like Rapunzel at this stage. Look, I would love to see things open more quickly. And just to be blunt about it, I would love to see us in that position. But equally, I never want to be back here again. So when we make this decision to move forward, I want it to be sustainable and I want it to continue to move in that direction. I do not want it to be one step forward, two steps back. We got ourselves in an awful bind last year. The executive was in shambles around trying to get the lockdown unpicked and trying to have the relaxations. We were lobbied heavily to do things for one sector and not another. Things became a tug of war between health and the economy, and it was all really unhelpful. We gave indicative dates and people took them like gospel, like they'd been handed down on tablets of stone, and then planned to those dates. And then were outraged when we couldn't meet those dates, even though it was driven by the best of intentions. So in truth, I don't think we can give dates. I think what we can give people is honesty. We don't control the virus at the minute, it controls us. We are rolling out the vaccine programme in Northern Ireland faster than anywhere else in these islands. So we have, I think, an optimistic opportunity. I think we've got to focus on conditions, and we've set out in the pathways document what the conditions are that we're trying to meet in order that we can move forward.
But Naomi,
I'm glad,
I mean, the pathway documents.
I'm glad this time we focused actually in relaxations. We prioritised people, not businesses and not money and not all the other things, but people. Because, you know, I think a lot of us just really want to see our friends and family and haven't been able to do that for a long time. And I think by doing that and education, those are the two things we've prioritised so far. I think we will then test the water and see how that goes. We've already seen in other places where schools have returned, for example, that the infection rates start to rise again. So we have to be cautious. We have to move cautiously, and we can't give people false hope. But I think we can give them real hope. But the vaccination program's going so well.
Okay, I mean, you say you're not going to give dates, and I think a lot of people actually understand where you're coming from there. But you said it was based on data and driven by conditions. Why does the pathway document not say, for example, you know, what the R number needs to be, or, you know, what the capacity at hospitals need to be?
Because it's not that simple.
Data in it.
It's not that simple. I mean, this is part of the difficulty. This is not an exact science. It just isn't. If people want us to be able to say at a certain point when these two graphs come, I mean, I worked as an engineer for years, and I'm used to data and evidence and how to weigh it. It's an inexact science. What we're doing is trying to balance the harms that cause, because lockdown causes harm. We know that. We know the impact that lockdown is having on people's mental health, physical health, and other things. So lockdown causes a degree of harm, and then the pandemic causes a degree of harm. And what we're trying to do is balance that and to find the right point at which to move. And there's no perfect solution. So it is about weighing things up and saying, well, at this stage, we think there is sufficient headroom for us to be able to do this. If things continue in this direction, we'll also be able to add other things on. But we're also relying on things like how quickly do we roll out the vaccine? Well, we're waiting to see how quickly we can get the actual volumes of vaccine through. We're also dependent a bit on the weather, because we know for a fact that last summer, outside the flu season, we saw a major dip in the spread of COVID. So all of those factors that we're weighing up, we're having to juggle. And it's not as simple as saying that we are looking at the evidence, we get the evidence every week. But it's not a straightforward medical decision. It's a societal decision. And I think it's informed by the medical evidence, but it isn't a medical decision, if that makes sense.
Okay, let's try to do, Naomi, because you've been very generous with your time, a couple of sort of quick fire ones to finish us off. Although they don't shy away from controversy, should the Northern Ireland centenary be celebrated?
No. No, not celebrated, marked. I don't think you can celebrate something that controversial in a society that is as divided as ours, but I think it's right that you should mark significant historic events. I think you do it in a measured and respectful way, and recognise that not everyone will want to be part of that.
Clearly this is about the stone or some sort of statue of some kind that's dormant.
Yeah.
Why did you feel that you needed to vote for that?
Because I think that it is a significant historic issue, whether you accept that, whether you see it as the partition of this island against the wishes of the majority democratically at that time, whatever the genesis of it. It was a significant event on this island. It is significant in the context of Northern Ireland's history, and I think it's reasonable that it's marked. It wasn't going to cost public money. It was a fairly neutral statue. It was just a carving of Northern Ireland on a plinth, and it said it was to mark the centenary. So I think, given all of the things that might have been suggested, that one was fairly neutral, and I think there has to be space for us to reflect cultures and views that we don't share. I wouldn't feel the need to celebrate Northern Ireland's centenary, but I do feel proud of our community, and that's something that I want to celebrate, but not necessarily in this context.
Okay, from Ben, what are your thoughts on decriminalising, legalising cannabis?
Well, again, as Justice Minister, not something in my bag, but look, I think that we've reached a point in terms of I think in terms of drugs policy more widely, that we need to move from a criminal justice-based approach to a health-based approach. And that's been my view for some time.
So that's kind of a yes.
Well, no, it's not simply saying that we decriminalise, because that may not be the answer, but I do think we need to move away from criminal justice-based approaches when it comes to substance abuse towards having a better and a health-based approach, because I don't think criminal justice-based approaches actually work for substance abuse. I think when it comes to cannabis, there's a slightly different argument as to whether or not, as a recreational drug, if you like, it should be legalised. And people, for example, in Canada, you can go to the local cannabis store in the same way that you can go to the local alcohol store, and they're all state run. So you go in and your province will have its own cannabis store. I'm not sure that's something that we're quite ready for in Northern Ireland, but I do think that there is a legitimate discussion to be had around it, and I think it's one that we need to have sooner rather than later.
It's such a cliche, but I'm morally obliged to ask it now that you've talked about recreational cannabis. Have you ever smoked recreational cannabis?
No, I've never smoked in my life, anything. Really? I hate smoking. My dad smoked cigars when I was a kid, and the stench of them put me off completely.
Even at university, Naomi, in a smoking area of a dingy nightclub, no?
No, the thing I hated about uni was coming home smelling of everybody else's smoke. I really dislike smoking. When it comes to smoking, I am not a liberal. I'm just putting it out there.
Would you increase taxes on cigarettes if you could?
Oh yeah.
To what?
Yeah. I wouldn't really care. I hate smoking.
If you had all the power,
I wouldn't ban them.
Cigarettes?
No, I'm too much of a liberal to ban them, but I would severely limit where they're smoked. I was one of the people who brought the smoking ban in Belfast before it was the law that you couldn't smoke in Belfast City Council premises and buildings and their vans and things, because I just think it's.
What about alcohol though? I mean, in terms of alcohol causes. No, I don't know this for sure. Alcohol causes surely nearly as many deaths per year in terms of its consequences, if not sort of.
You can't drink safely. You can't smoke safely. Okay,
that's a straight answer. You've sat as a councillor, an MLA, an MP, and an MEP. Very quickly, which is your favourite?
I'm enjoying what I'm doing now as minister, but probably out of the four, council.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Again, we'll do very quick ones here. You sat as an MEP for around 6 months or so. Was there really any point? Did you get anything done, or was it kind of just a 6 months?
Yeah, we did. We got a remarkable amount done. I was on the FEM committee, and we got some really good work done around violence against women and girls, and around gender-based strategies. We also did a lot of work around agriculture, and the deal being done with South America around beef prices. And actually,
you surely barely got your feet under the door before you're out.
Well, I was an experienced politician when I arrived, so I had the opportunity to make impact. But we also, and I think really importantly, I made a lot of contacts in that 6-7 months that I was there, who I'm still in touch with now. People who, when, for example, we're talking about trying to get deeds through the EU and so on, I can pick up the phone and speak to those people because I know who they are, they know me, and we're able to have that relationship. And I think that's really important for Northern Ireland going forward.
Okay, 2 more to go. Should controversial speakers be banned from speaking at universities?
That depends what they're saying. I don't mean that as a cop-out. I don't think controversy in itself should be a reason to stop somebody from speaking. I think we all need to be able to be challenged. But I think if people are peddling hate, then it's a matter of choice whether or not you give them a platform.
Okay, but I suppose that's difficult then, because who gets to decide what is peddling hate?
Well, I guess the person who issues the invite. I mean, I'm a liberal. I think people have a right to freedom of speech, but I don't have a duty to give them a platform. So if people want to say what they want to say, that's fine. I can't stop them doing that unless it crosses into the criminal. But I'm not obliged to give that speech and that viewpoint a platform as an individual. So if I'm organising an event, I will choose people who I think might be challenging, might say things I don't agree with, but I won't pick people who will peddle hate and dissent for the purposes of cause and offence, because it's not something I want to do. I'm not going to ban them from speaking generally. Somebody else wants to give them a platform, that's up to them.
Problem? But if everybody took that attitude, then there will be some people who are saying things that are not against the law, that do not constitute sort of legal hate speech, but would never be allowed to speak because everybody took the attitude that you've taken.
Well, it depends I mean, why would everybody take my attitude? Everybody's got their own views. And if somebody is saying something that nobody wants to hear, do they have a right to be heard?
Well,
do we all have a right to a platform? Do we? I don't know.
Does everybody have a right to free speech? It doesn't matter how many people are.
Well, they do, but what I'm saying is having a right.
Certain...
Well, and they can say it. Nobody has to listen. So your right to free speech isn't a guaranteed audience. It's simply that you're allowed to say it. You're not guaranteed an audience.
But but I suppose if everybody said you're not allowed an audience, then there would be some people who would never.
You're not saying they're not allowed an audience. You're saying they're not entitled to an audience. If people choose not to listen, that's a choice.
Is the best way, though, to combat people with whom you profoundly disagree not to engage them and debate and have conversations and try to convince them, or at least convince your audience that they're wrong?
That's my preferred approach. If you ever look at my Twitter account, you'll see that.
Yes.
People say don't feed the trolls. I spent most of my weekends engaging with them on a regular basis, and I now know some of them and have met some of them, and they're not as bad as they seem on Twitter. But that's my approach. I will engage with people. I will talk to them. I will debate with them because that's what I want to do. All I'm saying is that having freedom of speech doesn't entitle you to an audience. You shouldn't feel because you think you have something to say, everybody else should have to listen. So if you want to be heard and other people want to listen, you'll be invited to speak. I mean, I get invited to speak at things, not because everybody agrees with me, but because they want to hear what I have to say. And I think that's okay. If people then decide, actually, I don't really want to hear what she has to say, they'll stop inviting me. And I can't really demand that they listen to me if they don't want to.
Okay. Let's talk about social media as my final question. You've confessed before to being a social media addict who can't sleep at night, quote, if somebody's wrong on the internet. Is that the right way to do politics? Can that be counterproductive?
Yes.
It never seems to change anyone's mind, and it might seem a little bit petty sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. All of those things.
Why do you do it then?
Because, well, first of all, I'm well aware I've changed how I do social media over time. I spend less time on the internet since lockdown, largely because I don't think it is. I don't think it's particularly constructive at times. But part of the reason is that you're not talking to one person on Twitter. So this is what people miss. People say, well, why do you argue with the troll? You're never going to convince them. And that's true. But then people don't see my DMs where people are coming to me saying, thank you for having that argument because you were able to articulate something I feel that I couldn't have said. And actually, I wasn't sure I agreed with you, but when I read what you said, you've convinced me. So there's a degree of the debate that you have that isn't about convincing the person you're arguing with, but there are bystanders who are watching how you conduct yourself and what you say. And that is an influencer. So on some occasions it's worth doing. I think that as an argumentative person by nature, I find it hard to say, actually, I'm wasting my time, I'm going to move on. I do it, but I find it hard. I'm the kind of person when I start something, I find it hard not to finish it. So I watched Bloodlands and I knew from the first episode that this was a disaster. The choice I'd made was going to waste my life, 4 hours of my life. I would never get back, but I couldn't stop. If I read a book, even if it's a terrible book, I have to finish it. I'm quite determined in that way. And when I start an argument, I can't stop. So I have to learn to just restrain myself at times. I enjoy the argument.
Yeah.
Other people don't, but I do.
Bloodlands has been commissioned for a season 2. Would you? I think I read that the other day. Do social media companies? A final question, just because it's interesting. Do social media companies have too much power?
I don't know if they have too much power or they don't use it enough. I'm not sure which it is. Like, I do think that anonymous accounts on Twitter are an absolute disaster for any kind of civilized conversation. Most of the debate, abusive debate that I get are from fake accounts. And I think that if people just, I'm not talking about losing their anonymity online in the sense of having to use their own photograph and name. I think there are good reasons why people don't want to do that, but I think they should have to register their account with social media companies before they can go online, even if they do it under a pseudonym, because I just think that the fact that people can abuse and threaten and attack, I have death threats over the internet.
Register their account?
I think you need to register your account in your own name and evidence who you are before you can have a social media account.
And what is that evidence? What, a picture of your passport or something?
Well, I mean, there are lots of different ways that you can verify an account, but it should be traceable, because I think, for example, I've had social media death threats. I don't believe that people should be able to issue death threats from a position of complete anonymity. I just don't think that's acceptable. And I think social media platforms, again, need to take responsibility for the power that they have. But I think actually they're for good. So I'm a positive person.
Yeah.
I have met some really good friends on Facebook, people I didn't know before. I have made reconnections with people that I hadn't seen in a long time via social media. And I have been able to use social media platforms to get across my position and my point of view. So I can't knock the overall content. I think more could be done to deal with fake news. I think more could be done to deal with abuse online. I think the community standards are at times mind-boggling as to what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of discourse. But at the same time, it's part of my job that I engage. And I think for that reason that I probably approach it slightly differently. I think if it wasn't, I'd switch off.
It's the things you said, though. I wonder, I mean, verifying your accounts with sort of official information, declaring who you are, giving social medias more power over community standards, giving social media companies, all of these things are handing more authority and power to unelected sort of, technocrats who run social media companies is the counter argument. And I love Twitter and go on it all the time. Do you have any fear at all about how these companies are
yes,
not accountable?
I have fear.
And you're saying give them more power?
No, I'm saying that I think they have a lot of power already. So we know that they mine our data. They know what we're doing. You mention something and you look on Facebook and you're getting adverts about it, and we all know what happens. So they're using our data anyway. What I'm saying is, why is it then that they can't use our data for good? So if somebody is threatened, if somebody is stalked online and the police go to them and say, can you find out who owns this account? And they go, no, I just don't think that's acceptable. So what I'm saying is, I think that there needs to be, to me, the internet is like the Wild West. So there's a lot of good happening there. There's a lot of productive stuff going on, but there's a lot of stuff that is, pushing the boundaries to the absolute limit. And I do think that we need to find ways of making it safer for people. And I think that companies have a role to play in that, tackling hate crime, race, hate crime, misogyny, all of those things. I think that they need to take some responsibility as part of society, given that they are very powerful influencers. So I think it's about proportionate responsibility rather than saying that I want it to be a kind of big brother organization. But we all post our stuff. We all post our stuff online all the time.
Held by Twitter.
Yeah. No, we all post our stuff online all the time. And, I've been dealing with an issue recently where someone has contacted me in my constituency. Their photographs have been stolen, their name, details of their employment, and somebody has set up a kind of catfishing account on Tinder as them, but is using it essentially to try to lure young women. And it's really, it's causing huge distress to the individual who's been caught up in this, and could do huge reputational damage. Those are the sorts of things that I'm talking about, where just allowing people unverified, unchecked, to set up an account in a fake name and present themselves as something they're not is hugely dangerous, and actually something that I think social media needs to get a grip of. I accept that not everybody will want to put their name out into the public domain if they're expressing political opinions and so on. And I think there is space for people to still have a degree of anonymity. But when push comes to shove and somebody does something illegal online, it should be traceable.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. I don't think we'll solve the social media companies problem this evening. Thank you so much, Naomi Long, for giving up your time. You've been very generous. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. We got loads in for this event. Thank you to everybody who will watch this when you watch it back recorded. Naomi Long, thank you so much for giving up your time and for coming along and talking.